Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the President Folly podcast. Tonight I'm again joined by Keith Preston. We're going to discuss South Africa in review, before and after apartheid. I think it's illustrative to begin with is looking at just the stark differences in some of the areas of personal life. I mean, some of the statistics that you sent me in that World Not Daily article were pretty chilling. South Africa under apartheid was safe. I mean, rape and murder was kept at a minimum. Was not nearly as big of a problem as it is today. Today now it's skyrocketing. I mean, speaking of rape culture, this is a real rape culture. Uh, Also, Stefan Molyneux a couple of years ago had a very good lecture discussion on apartheid, and he demonstrated from statistics that something like only 15% of black students actually finish high school today in South Africa, some ridiculously low figure, whereas far more actually graduated from high school in apartheid in the Bantustans. And the other thing is, I don't remember what the clip is taken from, but there's this great clip on YouTube where this white liberal do-gooder is interviewing two working class black men in South Africa, and he's talking about their conditions of work, employment and other things, and he asks them, what would it take to make your life better? And this working class black guy, looks like he's probably in his 40s, says that a return to the Nationalist Party. Like, and the guy was like, "Are you crazy?" But then he's like, "But they didn't. They gave us jobs. We had employment. Life was good. It was safe." Um, and nowadays South Africa, it's a complete war zone. To be honest, I mean, this is terrible. Um, and so we see the distinction between, and again in the World Daily article you sent me, a lot of the, like even ANC folks are like, well, so apartheid was kind of better because at least it was safe and people could, get a job and walk out and not get mugged. And also, I forget where it was reported, but in 2002, 60% of South Africa said that, of the South Africans polled, said that life was better under apartheid. 60%. That was only 15 years ago they did that poll. And that was only 8 years after the end of apartheid. And now it's only gotten worse. One recent, very interesting development is the development of the genocide of the Boer population. Then the now sort of, I wouldn't say it's defunct, but it's no longer being updated, Genocide Watch, which was headed by Dr. Gregory Stanton, has described 8 stages of genocide. He said that South Africa's on stage 6, the preparation and planning phase, and that's the phase of white people, the Boers, the genocide of the Boers. And I think Jacob Zuma recently has said that he wants to confiscate all the white-owned property without any sort of compensation, and that they're really afraid for their lives now. I mean, it's just completely chaotic. It reminds me of the statement made by the atheist Matthew, I think his name is Matthew Paris. He said, "Why Africa needs God," and at the end of it, he says, of this essay that he wrote, article, "And I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of the malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete." And I think we can clearly see that in South Africa right now. But what are your sort of thoughts, Keith, on the life before and after apartheid, how South Africa's degraded since then?
Well, it's a complicated set of questions. One thing that needs to be considered is that during the time that apartheid was in place in South Africa, there was an enormous crusade in the Western world against the South African government of the time. I'm old enough to remember all of that, when Western countries were actually imposing sanctions on South Africa because of apartheid. There were large-scale protests against apartheid in the Western world. The cause of opposing apartheid was also a big cause among university students back in those days. Just like today, the university students are all about the LGBTQ configuration or whatever. Back then, protesting apartheid was a major area of interest for student radicals. I was in college back then. I was an undergraduate back then, so I remember that very well. However, a major problem is that while apartheid, whatever its faults, got a lot of criticism in the West, it was also true that during the same time, and still today, there were many other African nations where the political and economic problems and racial problems were at least as extreme as what you found in South Africa, often much worse. What happened in Africa? If we look at African history, we see that Africa always was severely underdeveloped in terms of its levels of technology and economic development, social development, things of that nature. Now, there are some people who try to dispute that, who argue against that. And from what I have been able to gather from the actual historical research that's available, it's true that there was a high level of development in North Africa historically, the areas that are Egypt, of course, and also the areas that are now Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, some of those countries. But if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we see that prior to the arrival of the European explorers, Vasco da Gama and all of those people, what we see is that very few, if any, of the native African cultures had developed any kind of sophisticated architecture in terms of, say, two-story buildings. There was very little in the way of development as far as actual writing, as far as keeping a calendar. Some of these indigenous cultures in Africa had yet to invent the wheel. And we're talking as late as the 19th century. As late as the 19th century, we had people on Earth that had not yet invented the wheel. In fact, as recently as the early 19th century, about a solid majority of the world's population was still in the hunter and gatherer stage as far as their level of social and economic and technological development, which is astounding to consider. At the time that the early railroads and things like that and early industries were being developed, most of the world's population was still in the hunter and gatherer stage, or at least the majority of the world's population. And most of Africa existed as a collection of European colonies for centuries, from roughly the 1500s up through the peak of the colonial period in the 19th century, early 20th century. And most of the old European empires were involved in colonizing Africa, like France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, England. Most of those nations had Portugal. Most of those European nations that developed these overseas colonies during the era of colonialism had holdings in Africa. And what happened is that in the post-war period, the post-World War II period, there was a dramatic change where these nations or these colonies in Africa started to become independent nations. And the main reason for that was the European nations were left in ruins after the two world wars, where they simply couldn't afford to maintain their overseas colonies anymore. I mean, they could barely sustain themselves. If it hadn't have been for the Marshall Plan, and they probably would not have recovered from the economic devastation of World War II. If it hadn't have been for NATO, they probably would have been subject to Soviet occupation. So as a result of this, the European nations were not able to sustain their overseas colonies, and that included their African colonies. So you started to see these growing anti-colonial movements in Africa, and also in Asia and other places as well. And one by one, these nations started becoming independent, and that was true in Africa. For example, all of the nations that were formerly colonies of Belgium, like Rwanda, Burundi, they became independent nations. Mozambique, which was a colony of Portugal, became independent. The Congo, on and on and on. We could go down the list. And the problem that emerged, though, is that when the African nations became independent, it's not that they ushered in this new era of peace and freedom and prosperity. It just the opposite happened in many instances. the new anti-colonial governments that came to power in African nations were often one-party Marxist states. That's what happened in Mozambique. That's what happened in Angola. There was a communist coup in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never really colonized to the degree that some of the other nations were in Africa, but there was a communist coup in Ethiopia in 1973, I believe. And you had the growth of communist insurgent movements in various other African nations, in the Congo under Patrice Lumumba and other places. And so in some instances, the new regimes that emerged post-colonialism were these one-party Marxist states that severely impeded economic development in some of these places. Also, in other places, they had overtly racist governments that would come to power in the replacement of colonialism. And when I say racist, I mean black against black racist, or black against white racist, or black against Asian racist. One of the most extreme examples was Idi Amin in Uganda. Came to power in 1971, carried out a genocide program against other African ethnic groups, against Asians, against whites, against anyone that was westernized. Very similar to what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot in the 1970s, although it was probably not as extreme in terms of the numbers. So you've also had civil wars that emerged post-independence in Africa. You had a lot of civil wars between rival ethnic and tribal groups, between different groups trying to control the post-colonial governments. One problem that Africa had was that the countries that are now the nations of Africa are not natural borders. They are largely just territories that were carved up by the older colonial powers. And when the colonial powers left, all you had left were these artificial nations that had been pieced together by the colonialists, and you had people of rival ethnic and religious and cultural factions living under the same government or in the same nation. Often they had been played off against one another as a means of maintaining political control during the colonial period, which lasted for centuries. That's one of the things, for example, that led to the genocide in Rwanda back in the early 90s. But during the last half a century or so, or during the post-war period in Africa, we've seen one problem after another with terrible dictatorships, genocides, civil wars, massacres. It's hardly the case that it was only in South Africa where there was racist oppression. Black on black racist oppression has been just as much a problem in Africa as white on black. For some reason or other, though, the South African government was a special target of animosity by a lot of Western people, and there was a lot of sanctions imposed on South Africa. There were protests against the government of South Africa all over the Western world for decades, until finally this apartheid fell, and what replaced it was this coalition government of the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. It's something similar. It actually happened some years earlier in Rhodesia, the former Rhodesia. The government of Ian Smith was replaced. It was overthrown by the current government of Robert Mugabe, and Robert Mugabe has essentially ruled as a communist dictator for something like 37 years now. And during that time, the level of economic prosperity in Zimbabwe has actually gone way down. I mean, in fact, there are jokes now about Zimbabwe's currency being the equivalent of the currency in the Weimar Republic, in the sense that it was worthless. And while South Africa hasn't had as negative an outcome as Zimbabwe or the former Rhodesia, there are ways in which South Africa has certainly deteriorated in the last 23 years since the former regime fell. One is that crime rates have gone through the roof. And that's also true that crime rates have gone down in South Africa in more recent years. What happened was that there was an explosion of crime rates and then a gradual decrease in crime rates. And also the unemployment rate in South Africa is extraordinarily high. It's one of the highest in the world. The wealth disparity there is actually higher now than it was under the former regime, which is astounding. And also there are a lot of other serious issues that South Africa has today that didn't exist in the past. Now, there are ways in which South Africa has improved since the end of apartheid. You do have a larger black middle class and things like that. It's actually very similar to what's happened in the United States since the post-civil rights era. In the post-civil rights era of the United States, we've seen black Americans, expand in terms of a much greater middle class. The black middle class is much larger. You have more black Americans in the professions and higher educational attainment on a more general level. And I'd say that the statistics show that probably about 4/5 of African Americans have actually done better in the post-Civil War. I mean, certainly post-Civil War, in the post-Civil rights era. However, it's also true that I'd say the lower 20% of African Americans have gone further down in terms of living standards, educational attainments, crime rates, and a lot of other social indicators in the last half a century. And something like that has happened in South Africa as well, although I would say on a more significant scale.
Yeah, yeah. I think it might be helpful to briefly sketch out sort of broad brushstrokes the history of South Africa. In the modern sense, I think in 1652, the Dutch created a trading station at Cape Town on the way to the East Indies, and gradually they developed. Initially, wasn't so much for settlement, but it developed more into a permanent settlement-based society. And the population there were the San tribes and the Khoikhoi. I think it's I don't know how you say it, but they were, of course, subjected to the Dutch rule. But one important point made by defenders of apartheid, which is a very good point that nobody makes anymore, is that many leaders in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the ANC were not Xhosa or San or these other tribes. They were Bantu. And Bantu were invaders just as much as the South Africans. They had come around 1000 to 1500 AD, and they had invaded with iron weapons. And the indigenous population did not have iron weapons, and so, well, they were done for. And, of course, against the guns of the West, the Bantu were done for. But what happens is you have two forces converging on South Africa, the Bantu coming down from Central Africa, and you've got the Dutch coming up or down and around from Europe. And then they don't really expand too much beyond the Cape. It's kind of inhospitable, the hinterland. And then in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain annexes Holland, South Africa from the Dutch, because at the time Holland was a French vassal. And the British had a much more pro-black policy. This was around the time of Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, and so a lot of the Boers felt disenfranchised, and so they went on the Great Treks in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, creating the Orange Free State and the I think it was the Natal Republics. And around the same time, you had the Zulu tribes also marching from into central South Africa. And that led to a big conflict between the Boers and the Zulu, culminating in the Battle of Blood River, I think it was 1838, where prior to that, they had treated with the Zulu king, and their leader, Pete Rediff, was massacred under a false flag of peace. And so they had to fight their way out of that, and they totally massacred. The Zulu got massacred. Spears and bows are no match against rifles. But so what we see here is there's two competing forces for control of South Africa, three at this point: the British, the Boers, and the Zulu, the Bantu. And ultimately what happens, and you have the Boer War where the British invade the Boer republics to get gold, and then they make a deal. In 1910, they create the South African Union. And they say, look, we'll let you manage all of South Africa, just play by the rules and be a part of the Commonwealth. And enough South Africans bought into it that they made the deal. Now, throughout this entire period of British and Dutch rule, there are, slavery, the British end slavery, but before that there was slavery, racial segregation. And what happens then is apartheid really becomes an issue in the post-World War II era, when you have in 1948 where apartheid is actually implemented. Now, I recently listened to the interview of President Vorster of South Africa in 1974 by William F. Buckley Jr. And I read some various articles, essays and articles written by defenders of apartheid. And they argue that the principle of apartheid was separate development, sort of like the separate but equal in the United States, but it's a little different. I'll get into that. The basic premise of apartheid was that in order to keep racial tension down and to maintain a level of peaceful accommodation in the South African context, racial segregation was perceived to be the most effective way to do this. Now, Vorster was asked by Buckley, well, what about in America? We don't have that problem. Because, this is in the 70s after desegregation. And he's like, well, it's different in America. It's not the same everywhere in the world. And he said there were the communities. There was basically the white, the British and the Dutch community. There was the Indian community. The British imported a lot of Indian coolies to do railroad work. Gandhi got started in South Africa. The coloreds, the mixed races, and then the blacks, which were the vast majority of the population, something like 80%. And they had what they call Bantustans, which were quasi-autonomous tribal communities within the larger South African federation system. And the way Vorster describes it was, they're like reservations in the sense that these are the areas where these people live and govern themselves, but they're unlike reservations in that they were not deported there, like, say, for instance, when the United States found gold in the Black Hills and they drove off the Sioux to a new reservation. These, were the original areas settled by these Bantu tribes when they came into Africa, or even the, Xhosa and the San tribes. Those are their original settlements, and then they have limited self-government within those settlements. Now, the purpose of separate development was that ideally the coloreds, the blacks, the Indians would, within their own local communities, reach a level of self-government on parity with whites. This was always, from the very beginning, stated as the objective of apartheid. In 1953, A.L. Geyer wrote in The Case for Apartheid that, the ultimate goal was that they would become self-governing on par with whites, but that they were not ready for it yet. And so they would give them gradual autonomy within their Bantustans. And, of course, the equivalent for the coloreds and the Indian tribes. The other thing is about apartheid and African development in general, because Keith, you mentioned the wider African context in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, was the underdevelopment of so many African countries. And Vorster believed, and I think you made a good point in the interview, that it was due to the tribal system. Because in Africa, the tribal system is essentially absolute despotism. It's total autocracy. It may be very small, maybe no more than 100, 300 people in a tribe, but the chief is absolute monarch of all he surveys. He has absolute power, and people are taught to be obedient to the chief, and that's not really suitable for self-government. And he seemed to think that the millennium of servitude under chieftanism was holding Africa back. And he believed that the process of educating the black Africans to the point of self-government would take a very long time, because you're having to undo thousands of years of culture and government that the Africans have lived with. And he didn't think it would be done in his lifetime, maybe not even in 100 years. And certainly removing the barriers to segregation without having anything ready in its place has led to a lot of racial tension, which is exactly what was predicted by the crafters of the apartheid system. And let's not kid ourselves, prior to the European settlement, there was no racial harmony in South Africa. The Bantu tribes were exploiting and conquering the San and Xhosa tribes for their own benefit, and there was wars between them as well. In fact, in the 1800s, one of the border wars between the Boers and the Xhosa was because the Xhosa were stealing their cattle. Now, see, in South Africa, the black Africans valued cattle as a form of currency. And so everything was valued in cattle. And so cattle thieving, like in places like even Ireland in the Middle Ages as well, that was a thing too. That's what was stolen, because cattle was seen as the object of value. And so that led to conflict there as well. One of the things I think needs to be pointed out as well is that whatever the racial or ethnic grievances and the land distribution, it seems that there's sort of like two narratives, right? There's the narrative of the black Africans. It was all stolen from us by the Boers. Now, the Boers said that And they said, well, we bought the land or it was unsettled. I think it's probably a combination of all three. Some of the land was probably taken by force by both blacks, Bantu tribes, and the whites. And some land was bought, and some land was probably unoccupied. And I don't know enough about the context of Africa to say which case was which, but I think it's some admixture of all three, and it's not so easily packaged the way the far left would want to do it or the far right.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of nuances that don't get brought into the discussion when South Africa is discussed. One involves the ethnic conflict that does exist by some of the black tribes in that region. For example, you mentioned how many of the black South Africans are actually Bantu, but there's also a long-standing rivalry between the Zulu and the Bantu that's not often discussed in the West. Ironically, there's also something of a rivalry among white South Africans between the Afrikaners and the English-speaking white South Africans, the Boers. That's another issue as well.
Well, after the Boer War, that's understandable, right? Being the first victims of concentration camps.
Yes, yes. In fact, I've actually had conversations with white South Africans who say that there's actually a fairly high level of ethnic tension even today between Boers and Afrikaners. But the issue, I think, was that under the old apartheid system, their system was more or less about trying to, on one hand, maintain the system of racial segregation, but on the other hand, they also wanted to utilize the cheap black labor for a lot of purposes as well. I think that's one of the problems that system had, was that the white elites in South Africa kind of wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have the apartheid system, but they wanted to make use of black labor when it was convenient. Now, there were also ways in which blacks certainly faced discrimination as far as labor. That in certain sectors, it was illegal, for example, to hire blacks as employees. In fact, another thing that's often not recognized is that initially there was a lot of support for apartheid from the left. Way back in the 1920s, the South African Communist Party had a slogan, "Workers of the World Unite for a White South Africa." And initially, there was a great deal of hostility to black labor, which they viewed as a competition to white labor. Now, they did an about-face later on and joined the anti-apartheid movement, probably for opportunistic reasons. But this was certainly an issue. So the problem, though, with a lot of the old system, the apartheid system, was that you had this kind of system that on one hand it was supposed to be a system of separate development, but on the other hand it was also a system of internal colonialism that wanted to make use of black labor. On one hand they wanted to have separate development, but yet there was a certain denial of the access to resources that were necessary for separate development. One problem with the Bantustan system was that the Bantustans tended to be located in regions of South Africa that tended to be the worst land, which made self-development and self-sufficiency somewhat difficult, even without some of the other problems you mentioned, like some of the cultural problems, which were certainly present. It's true that in the tribal system in Africa, their traditions are very autocratic and authoritarian. And in fact, in traditional African culture, wealth was measured in terms of slave possession. You were a wealthy person in traditional Africa if you owned lots of slaves. They had no conception of land ownership. Land ownership wasn't part of their traditional culture there, but wealth was measured in terms of slaves. So Africa was always a slave society. That didn't start with the transatlantic slave trade or the coming of the Europeans. That certainly existed before that. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why the transatlantic slave trade developed, is because they already had such an elaborate system of slavery in Africa, and the Europeans came in and made use of it. But the problem, though, was that there were too many contradictions in the older system. I think that if apartheid had been structured in a way more like the Swiss canton system, where there was a genuine system of autonomy for different groups, and there was a certain effort to define the borders in a way where there was some equitable distribution of resources in terms of land. I think it may have had a better outcome in the long run. There was a book written back in the late 80s by a couple of South African economists, Leon Lowe and Francis Kendall, where they discussed this. They talked about how apartheid had certain built-in mechanisms that actually impeded economic development in South Africa. And of course, they were opposed to the coming to power of groups like the ANC and the South African Communist Party and groups of that type. And because that had happened in other African nations before that, as I said, you had gotten these one-party Marxist regimes that had run the economy into the ground. So what they tried to do, what Lowe and Kendall tried to do, was they advocated for a Swiss-like system that was based on genuine autonomy and trying to define the borders of the different cantons that they wanted to create in South Africa according to natural boundaries as much as that was possible. And that the book that they wrote that actually advocated for this system became a bestseller in South Africa, but it was completely ignored as far as any policy making was concerned. But it would have been interesting to see what would have happened to South Africa if this idea had actually been pursued.
Oh, sorry about that. I must have muted myself. How long was I muted?
You're muted for maybe a minute.
Oh, where did I cut off? I can't believe I muted myself.
I couldn't hear anything you were saying before. I stopped talking and then you went dead silent. So.
Oh, yeah, okay. Ilana Mercer in her book Into the Cannibal's Pot, Lessons for America from Post-Apartheid South Africa, quotes W.A. de Klerk in his The Puritans in Africa. And because the point that I'm getting at here is the internal contradictions within apartheid, wanting to have your cake and eat it too, is what you said. I think is it as a representation of the internal contradictions within the Boer society. De Klerk says, the basic dilemma of Western man is how to reconcile power with justice. Those within the Calvinist Puritan ethic who seek to secretly yearn for power find it impossible to do so openly and unashamedly. Naked power is not possible for a Western Christian man, especially of Calvinist Puritan leanings. For Christian man, especially for Puritan man, the quest for power, a quest very much alive, cannot be an open bid for supremacy, but rather has to be a power acceptable in Christian terms. It must be power driven by a devotion to a great ideal. And she has this within the context of the head of the South African Defense Force, and he said, this is like in '94. He said, "You and me and our men could take the country in an afternoon," said the chief of South African Defense Force, General Viljoen, famously to the reigning Chief General George Neering. He uttered this comment as President de Klerk prepared to cave into ANC demands, foregoing all checks and balances for South Africa's Boer, British, and Zulu minorities. Yet the very same Afrikaner people in the same spirit went on to peacefully dismantle the 6 nuclear devices they had built at Pelindaba. Why then do the Afrikaners give up their birthright for a mess of pottage? So you see, the black Africans, when he asked that question, the other general said, well, I know what the Africans did. They'd be partying. So like when they won apartheid, they were partying. It's like, hey, we won. It's a good time, guys. But the Boers, being Calvinists, they have a hard time reconciling with the power. And so on the one hand, they want to use power. to some extent, it's necessary to maintain law and order. But on the other hand, they, with their Christian heritage, have an uncomfortable relationship with it. And in a lot of ways, a manifestation of that uncomfortable relationship or internal contradiction is manifested in some of the systems in apartheid. Like you said, they want cheap black labor, but they don't want to have blacks, with full rights in the area. Now, you said that the development in the Bantu stands was more difficult because of lack of funding, lack of good land to work on. Now, how would functionally? It seems like what was described in after apartheid seems sort of on paper what apartheid was supposed to be. So how is it not that? I guess, was it just on paper they said it was going to be that way, but in practice it didn't turn out that way?
Yeah, well, a similar situation existed in South Africa as what currently exists in Palestine, in the sense that while theoretically the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be self-governing and the Palestinians are supposed to have some degree of autonomy under that system, it's also true that Israel keeps trying to grab Palestinian land for itself. They keep trying to expand Israeli settlements into Palestinian territories. The original proposal for full autonomy for the Palestinians that was developed some years back essentially created a system like the South African Bantustans, and that's one of the reasons why it was rejected. But the same problem existed in South Africa in the sense that while on one hand the ideal was separate development and political autonomy and things like that, it was also true that the South African government wanted to essentially retain the most fertile land. They wanted to maintain all of the resources that would be needed to maintain economic superiority. There wasn't really interest in sharing in that sense. So as a result, what you ended up with was a system where with apartheid with the Bantustans, the blacks and the other groups, the Indians and the coloreds, were restricted largely to a segregated system that was closer to what the United States used to practice. During the period of separate but equal in the United States, in the pre-civil rights period, the official doctrine was separate but equal. That the blacks and whites are supposed to be equal, but they simply have separate institutions and all of that. But the problem with it is that it wasn't equal. You would have very little funding, for example, for education for blacks in the United States. Blacks would be relegated to substandard services and institutions. For example, black schools were certainly terrible in certain parts of the United States. Blacks were not able to have access to basic services in certain instances. They were denied access to certain professions. They were denied admission to colleges. So it's not like blacks under the system of separate but equal were ever given the opportunity to practice any kind of social or economic or political equality. Just due to the imbalance of resources that was present and the exclusion from various other kinds of resources that were needed for development. And a similar situation existed in South Africa. Walter Williams, who's an American black conservative, I guess, libertarian-leaning conservative, had a book back in the 80s called, I think it was called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. But Walter Williams actually argued extensively and documented pretty well how this system worked, about how South Africa in practice was, under apartheid, was supposed to be a system of self-development, but in essence it was a type of system of national socialism, in the sense that it was basically socialism for the white elites, in the sense of excluding blacks from the meaningful opportunities to practice economic self-development. So I think that's really the root of the problem in South Africa. It was the fact that on one hand, you had an official system of self-government under the Bantustans, but there was no way for that to have any meaning without the resources not being present for that. And again, it's similar to what happened with the United States under Jim Crow and stuff like that was probably a little more extreme. It's similar to what has happened with the Palestinians and Israel, although I don't know that it was quite as extreme as that. But it's a similar type of system in each of the three cases.
Yeah, yeah. One of the premises in after apartheid that I find somewhat well, it's partially correct, but I think they overemphasize it. Is that they argue that the problem in South Africa at the time, and probably even would probably still say today, is the size of the government, and that people are squabbling over who has the levers of power. So it makes sense to just shrink the government down so there's just a fight over. That's partially true, but that's not going to solve the long-standing ethnic and racial tensions by itself, and which cut across, white versus white, Boer versus British, black versus black, Zulu versus Xhosa. These are still going to be there with or without a. In fact, there was no government of South Africa when the Bantus and the Dutch showed up, and they still have this kind of racial hostility. So something far more systematic needed to happen. Though certainly reducing the size of the government is a good step. It's not in and of itself, I think, enough to solve the actual problem that was going on in South Africa. Another thing to point out is we need to keep in mind, for all the flaws of the apartheid system, it worked rather well. It was if you look at Africa in the life expectancy of the African from 1948 to 1965, something like that, black African, went from like 54 to 62. And by the apartheid, it was like, I think, in the 70s, by the end of apartheid. And then it went back down to like the 50-ish, 55 during the post-apartheid era. They had their own nuclear program. There was some controversy over some nuclear tests in the Indian Ocean that they did jointly with these Israelis. During the brush wars against the communist forces in Angola and Namibia, they performed under incredible stress and odds amazingly well on the battlefield. They were net exporter of manufactured goods. And like I said, life was safer back then. The first open heart surgery was performed in South Africa. I mean, imagining South Africa today being a leader in medical technology is kind of laughable, but back in the 60s it was. And the other consideration is, what was the alternative? What were the alternatives then and now to apartheid South Africa? They were the kind of alternative that we in the West would have liked, a more racially tolerant system that was less based on racial envy and prejudice, was never really going to happen. As Walter Williams said, the blacks weren't fighting for freedom, they were fighting to be the dictator. And under the ANC, they wanted to be the guy with the big stick to beat up on their traditional enemies. They didn't really have a commitment to freedom and liberty in a way that some of the United States or England would understand it. And at the time in South Africa, the ANC was founded as a Marxist party. That has to be stated. Mandela was a Marxist in the beginning of his career. He said that he supported the South African Communist Party completely. His wife, Winnie Mandela, was famous for using the terrorist technique of rubbernecking, where you'd put gasoline-drenched tires around people's necks and then light them on fire. Terrible stuff was going on with these ANC rebels. So if they had taken over in the 60s, it would have been a Mugabe Congo-style bloodbath. No doubt about it. And today, they're moving in that direction anyhow. You got, Jacob Zuma singing, "Kill the Boer" in his election rallies, threatening to confiscate all of the property of white landholders, much like Mugabe did 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, I should say. And so they're really, you have to pick the least bad situation sometimes. And I think a far more profitable route would have been to, rather than advocate for the immediate dismantling of apartheid and one man, one vote throughout the country, which, as we've seen the past 30 years, has been a disaster, rather to seek to reform. A better policy would have been to seek to reform apartheid from within, to demand them live up to the standard of separate development, and use economic pressures to to get them to move towards a more consistent application of their stated objectives.
Yeah, well, I would agree with most of what you said. Um, as I said earlier, when I was in college as an undergraduate, the anti-apartheid movement was something that was very interesting to students at the time, and there used to be a lot of anti-apartheid protests. I remember during that time period, I used to read a lot about South Africa because it was such a big issue at the time, and I always thought, or at least I came to the conclusion from everything I read about the situation there, that if the apartheid government fell, it was quite likely they would end up getting the kind of government that they had during those years in Mozambique or in Angola or in Zimbabwe, where you would have a one-party Marxist state led by would have amounted to black supremacists. And I didn't really see how that would be an improvement over the apartheid system. And I do think that a system more like what Leon Lowe and Francis Kendall had advocated for back then, which was basically taking apartheid and making it more like the Swiss system, where it would be a system of decentralized self-management, but in a more equitable way. I really think that what ultimately undid South Africa, and you're right that South Africa was a first world country. South Africa during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was a first world country. It could have easily been a European nation in terms of its level of internal wealth and industry and technological development. You mentioned the first heart transplant was done there. I actually remember that when that was done. So South Africa was a first world nation. It had this racial stratification system that, as I mentioned, had all these internal contradictions to it. I think that the better solution would have been, rather than turn the country over to groups like the ANC and the South African Communist Party, a system of genuine self-determination would have been much more viable. The African National Congress and the South African Communist Party were largely the same organization. I mean, they were separate organizations, but there was such an overlap in terms of leadership and membership, they might as well have been the same organization. Nelson Mandela himself had actually been a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party at one point. And they also had a very strong relationship with communist governments and movements throughout Africa, like the one in Zimbabwe, like the one in Mozambique, like the one in Angola, like insurgent forces in various countries. They were pro-Soviet. A lot of the leaders of the South African Communist Party, the ANC, praised the conquest of Southeast Asia by the Vietnam and by the Khmer Rouge when that happened. So these people, many of them came from hardline communist backgrounds. And while the system that's been imposed in South Africa at the conclusion of apartheid has been to a large degree based on the Western model of parliamentary democracy, it's certainly, in terms of its organizational structures, it's certainly pursued a lot of comparable policies to what some of these other states have pursued, like Zimbabwe, in the sense of land confiscation, in the sense of racial quotas that are of a retaliatory nature. And certainly we've seen crime, as we talked about, go through the roof in South Africa in a way that's fairly disturbing in many instances. And those kinds of problems didn't exist under the old system. Now you had other problems under the old system, like state repression and things like that may have been eased in some ways and increased in others. But you didn't see the kind of breakdown of civil society under the old system quite on the level that's what's happened in the post-apartheid period, which is significant because the crime problem, the violence that has happened in South Africa it's not just black on white violence. There's a lot of black on black violence as well. So it's not something that's good for anybody, any ethnic or racial group.
Yeah, because what people don't understand, at least what Western liberals and Western socialists don't understand, is when they look at Africa, they see black people. When Africans look at Africa, they see people of different tribes. You're not my tribe, you're their tribe, you're my enemy. They don't understand that. The same thing goes with Hispanics, and it's not even in other countries, it's in the United States. For instance, when everybody predicted Donald Trump would bomb with Hispanics, even though he got the most votes of any Republican since forever, they didn't understand that not all Hispanics are the same. Cubans and Puerto Ricans don't have the same values as Mexicans and Guatemalans, who don't have the same values as Costa Ricans and Hondurans. And so they have this very simplified view of race that makes them blind to the actual subtleties within races. That hampers their ability to analyze and provide solutions to these problems. But I think one of the problems that I have with after apartheid, as far as fighting for self-government is, of course, I think a good idea, where people should be able to govern their own affairs. The deeper question, when we talk about apartheid, is were the black African population at the time or today capable of self-government? Now, at the time, the apartheid white minority rule said they were not. And it's kind of hard to argue with them with the 25, 30 odd years since the end of apartheid.
Yeah, well, there are parts of Africa, though, including Southern Africa, where you do have black-dominated governments that are run fairly competently. Botswana is one example.
Yeah, Malawi as well, I think.
I think that under the system that after apartheid advocated for, that Lowe and Kendall advocated for, I think probably what you would have found is some self-governing black cantons or territories that became fairly successful, like Malawi or like Botswana, and others that didn't. Others went more in the direction of Zimbabwe. That would be my best guess as to how that would have turned out.
Probably the wider African context itself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what you see when you look across the entire African continent. You see places like Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, where the level of stability or development is somewhat higher, maybe Kenya. And then you see places like the Sierra Leone, like Mozambique, like Angola, like Rwanda, where you've had terrible genocides, where you've had unbelievably corrupt or authoritarian rulers. You've had, I mean, in the 20th century, and probably even the early 20th, first century, we actually had leaders of states in Africa that practiced cannibalism. So you might have found that in some instances, and then you might have found a more stable model that developed under other circumstances. And I think that gets back to what you mentioned earlier about the ethnic and cultural differences that you see among people in Africa. There are literally hundreds of ethnic groups in Africa, and they don't all consider each other to be part of the same race or ethnicity or culture or anything like that. Just the opposite. It is similar to the Hispanics as far as, or the people from Latin America. If for example, you look at photographs of people from Mexico of different backgrounds, if you look at, say, a portrait of the parliament in Mexico or the cabinet in Mexico, what you'll find is that they look essentially like white people. They don't look fundamentally different. They look like they could be Southern Europeans, like Spaniards or Portuguese or Italians. On the other hand, if you look at some of the poorer people in Mexico, they look more like Native Americans, or they look more, they have much darker skin. The same is true with interracial, black and Hispanic or Latino relations in parts of Latin America. In Latin American countries where you have a sizable black population, like Venezuela or like Nicaragua, you see the same kind of racist attitudes towards blacks there that you find in North America. So it's not that white people invented these kinds of things. The rivalries between different nationalities, between different African nationalities, and it's the same with Asians and with Latin Americans as well, is extremely intense. I in my own life come across people all the time from Africa and immigrants who dislike African immigrants from some other nationality or some other ethnic background. So these kinds of problems are universal. And given that they are so intense in Africa, I do tend to be skeptical as to whether the whole Western model of one person, one vote could work in some of those countries, because voting takes place along tribal and ethnic lines to such an intense degree. It's very similar to the way elections tend to work in the Middle East. When they have an election in the Middle East, Sunni vote with Sunni, Shia vote with Shia, Kurds vote with Kurds, and the outcome is predetermined, even before you take the vote. And it's hard to have a Western model liberal democracy, which is based ostensibly on rational discourse, debating the pros and cons of different policies and issues.
Yeah, it does make it very difficult. I think the question of apartheid in South Africa is kind of an element of the larger question of Africa in general. If we look at the European colonial powers, if we look at Rhodesia and South Africa, which could be interpreted as the last remnant of those colonial powers, they all made the claim the Africans were not ready for self-government, and they said that we can't give it to them yet. And the socialists, the liberals said, nope, just give it to them now. We'll sort it out later. And like I said, the history of Africa since the beginning of decolonization has done more than anything, I think, to confirm the suspicions and claims of the imperialists, the Rhodesians, and the South Africans. The question is, what do you do about that? Because clearly the method that was chosen was a disaster. We ended up with, one-party Marxist states, genocides, terrible countries that just failed to work at every possible level. One wonders how you could have more, maybe come to a more equitable system from the colonial system in a way that's not as disastrous as what we've seen today,
Well, there was a really interesting book that was published about 20 years ago by a scholar from Ghana. The book was called Africa Betrayed, and the author's name was George. I have a difficult time pronouncing African names, but it's George Ayiti, I believe was his name. This book, I guess, came out probably in the early 90s. But anyway, what George Ayiti argued was that part of the problem was that you had these artificial boundaries in the African nations, that there was no effort in the post-colonial period to redesign the boundaries of African nations along more natural lines, where people of different tribes, of different ethnic groups, of different cultural or religious or whatever backgrounds would be able to practice self-determination in territorial units where they were largely homogenous or where there was some commonality of interest. What happened is that the colonialists left, but everything else remained the same, and all of the institutions and political divisions that had been created by colonialism continued to be in place, and along with that, all of the same ethnic rivalries and things of that nature. So what happened was that you had all of these different ethnic groups that had been played off against one another in a sort of a divide and control system under colonialism. That all of a sudden, the ones that had been more disadvantaged were out for revenge, or else the different groups were simply striving for political supremacy, or they were in a system where you had them all mixed up in the same political units, so everyone is trying to get the upper hand and trying to create this kind of ethnic or tribal voting bloc, or a racial spoils system, or ethnic spoils system, or however you want to describe it. I think this system really is something that would need to be changed for Africa to be able to practice self-determination in a meaningful way. In addition to the fact that a lot of the leadership of anti-colonial movements was pretty sorry. You had a lot of people that were ironically influenced by a lot of bad ideas that they imported from the West, like communism and things of that nature. I think that was a real issue. A lot of times the the post-colonial governments were largely remnants of the old colonial governments, in the sense that the kind of quisling rulers largely remained on top and created a new system of exploitation of their own, or they were overturned by something just as bad or worse. So none of these problems were ever addressed. It was always just the idea, well, the colonialists just need to get out and everything will be fine, which wasn't the case at all. Like I said, this book, Africa Betrayed, is one of the best studies of this that I'm aware of. It came out, see, I'm looking it up now. It came out in 1994. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great book. I remember reading it probably when it came out, and it really gets into this in a lot of detail, talking about how Africa has had so many problems along these lines, and it has to do with a lot of different causative factors, including these kind of unnatural boundaries that they have.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot. There's no. In history, we learn there's no one cause for any particular historical event. And so Africa's issues are, of course, multifaceted. So I think we can maybe discuss how we might weigh those facets, which one is more important than the other. But I think that one thing that's interesting is that with Africa is that prior to European contact, as you pointed out, they really hadn't developed at all. You know, and you made a point. We talked private message each other prior to this. The colonial were the colonial powers ruthless and brutal? Sure. I mean, there's some were more brutal than others. The British and the Germans were probably the best run and the most civilized. The Belgians and the French might have been the worst. But the fact is, though, since the end of colonialism, genocide has, if anything, ramped up. In 1998-2003, there was the Second Congolese Civil War. Anywhere from 2.5 to 5 million people died. I mean, that's on par with the numbers estimated for the deaths caused by Leopold II in the Congo Free State, in the 19th century. We've had 1 million people died in Ethiopia under the communist Mengistu regime. And there was the 1960s Civil War in Congo, which claimed hundreds of thousands, at least, if not millions of lives. So it's not entirely clear that Africa, the propensity to extermination wasn't already there to begin with. And if you look at tribal warfare, I know I'm flogging a dead horse again, but warfare before civilization, as Lawrence Keeley points out, by definition is total genocidal warfare. And when you give these tribal societies machine guns and modern weapons, you can just imagine the kind of carnage they could wreak on the battlefield to one another based on their views. And so I think that I would agree that with what your statement we had before, that those African countries that are largely better off because of European colonization, despite the brutalities of the initial conquest and the inequities during the rule over Africa. Because if you look at the black rulers, they're even more corrupt, more cruel than the European predecessors. So it's not that you got the same. The old boss is worse than the new boss. It's not even he's not even the same. He's worse. Yeah,
well, one of the benefits that I think colonialism brought to Africa was it did bring European culture. It brought European economic development, European law, European technology, and things like that. And I think that many blacks in Africa and in other parts of the world as well are actually better off for colonialism having taken place. For instance, probably of any nation that has a sizable black population, African Americans are probably the most well off people of African ancestry anywhere in the world, I would guess. I'm not an expert on this, but I would guess that is the case. In terms of the core issues that we use to measure quality of life, like life expectancy or death from preventable disease or infant mortality rates or per capita income consumption and things like that. So probably the majority of the African nations, and certainly the black diaspora around the world, probably in the long run at least, has been better off because of colonialism. And as to even if it hadn't, if colonialism had never happened, would Africa be a better place today? I don't know that it would be, given the level of development that had existed there before. If the Another issue is that the life expectancy issues and things like that, the quality of life just in terms of health and all of these kinds of things, death and diseases was always very low there as well. Not just in terms, it wasn't just that their technological development was not very advanced. Their standards of health and life expectancy and all of those things were fairly low as well, and still are. And I don't know that colonialism can really be blamed for that. It's something that's always been there. It's always been part of that, a problem for that region of the world. So that's another thing to consider as well. One of the benefits of colonialism is that it brought Western medicine and industrial technology and water purification methods and things of that nature that cut back on disease and the spread of malaria and things of that type.
Yeah, well, I think we're about out of time. Is there anything that you want to end with before we wrap it up?
Well, one thing that I find interesting about these kinds of discussions is that my political outlook is such that I'm mostly about critiquing systems of power. And one problem that I have noticed among a lot of people, certainly left and right, is that many people just seem to define their political outlook in terms of, we need to put the bad guys out of power and put the good guys in power. And I remember during the anti-apartheid movement, when that was still around, that's how a lot of anti-apartheid activists that I came across actually thought. We need to put these bad guy, racist white people out of power and put some good guy black folks in. And I, then as now, I used to think, well, it's not quite that simple. It's the systems of power can be dangerous, irrespective even of the motivations of the people who hold power. And then when you have people who have negative motivations to start with, systems of power become even more dangerous. We see that over and over and over again. I suppose in many ways I agree with the criticisms that both the left and the right have of each other, that the right is too comfortable with the status quo or too attached to the past or too willing to overlook current problems, whereas the left is too hesitant to leap before they look or not consider potential future problems or simply replace one group of bad guys with another group of bad guys or in the name of doing good, screwing things up and making them worse. It seems like both of those are both that whole dichotomy is something that keeps having a push-pull effect over and over and over again.
Yeah. I think the lesson to learn from apartheid, I don't remember who said this, probably Machiavelli, but the point of politics is not to strive for the ideal, but the possible. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.